I have spent decades working criminal investigations. I have seen cases that haunt you. Cases that challenge everything you thought you knew about evidence, about guilt, about the system itself. But few cases in my career have demanded as much reflection as the one I am about to discuss with you today. This is not a simple story. This is not a case with clear answers. This is the West Memphis Three. In May of 1993, in a small Arkansas town called West Memphis, 3 8-year-old boys were brutally murdered. Their bodies were found in a drainage ditch in an area locals called Robin Hood Hills. Within a month, 3 teenagers were arrested and charged with the killings. Within a year, all 3 were convicted. One was sentenced to death. The other 2 received life sentences. For many, justice had been served. But for others, this case became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when fear, prejudice, and flawed investigation converge. I want to take you through this case from beginning to end. I want to examine the evidence, the investigation, the trials, and the aftermath with the same scrutiny I would apply to any case file that crossed my desk. I want to be clear about what we know, what we do not know, and where the truth may lie somewhere in the shadows between. This will not be a short examination. This case demands time, attention, and careful consideration. So let us begin. Before we continue, I need to clarify something. The images you are seeing are not real footage. They are imaginary visual representations created only to help explain the case. Nothing you see should be interpreted as actual documentation of the events, the victims, or the accused. This is a reconstruction for educational purposes only. West Memphis, Arkansas, in 1993, was a working-class community sitting just across the Mississippi River from Memphis, Tennessee. The population hovered around 28,000 people. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where kids rode their bikes through neighborhoods without much concern, where the pace of life moved slower than in the big cities. But beneath the surface, West Memphis had its share of problems. Poverty was prevalent. Drug use was increasing. And like many small towns in America during the early 90s, there was a growing unease about crime, about violence, about the changing world. The 3 victims in this case were Christopher Byers, Michael Moore, and Stevie Branch. All 3 were 8 years old. All 3 were second graders at Weaver Elementary School. And on the evening of May 5th, 1993, all 3 vanished. Christopher Byers lived with his mother, Melissa, and his stepfather, John Mark Byers. John Mark Byers was a colorful figure in West Memphis, known for his loud personality and his tendency toward confrontation. Christopher was described by teachers and family as an energetic child, sometimes difficult to manage, but generally well-liked by his peers. His biological father was largely absent from his life, and John Mark had stepped into that role, for better or worse. Michael Moore came from a more stable household. His parents, Todd and Dana Moore, were working-class people who did their best to provide for their children. Michael was described as a happy child, outgoing, the kind of kid who made friends easily, or he was close to Stevie Branch. And the 2 boys spent much of their free time together. Stevie Branch lived with his mother, Pam Hobbs, and his stepfather, Terry Hobbs. Like Christopher Byers, Stevie's biological father was not a consistent presence in his life. Terry Hobbs worked long hours, and by many accounts, the household was not without its tensions. Stevie was remembered as a sweet child, perhaps quieter than his friends Michael and Christopher, but equally beloved by those who knew him. On the afternoon of May 5th, 1993, the 3 boys were last seen together riding their bicycles in the neighborhood. According to witness statements collected during the investigation, the boys were spotted at various locations throughout the late afternoon and early evening. Some witnesses reported seeing them near the Robin Hood Hills area, on a wooded patch of land adjacent to a drainage canal known locally as 10 Mile Bayou. The area was a popular spot for children to play, though it was also known as a place where teenagers would sometimes gather, drink, or engage in other activities away from adult supervision. By nightfall, the boys had not returned home. Their families began to worry. By around 8 or 9 in the evening, parents were making phone calls, knocking on doors, searching the neighborhood. When the boys still could not be located, the West Memphis Police Department was contacted. A search was organized that evening, but darkness and limited resources hampered efforts. The search continued through the night and into the next morning. On May 6, 1993, at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, a juvenile probation officer named Steve Jones discovered a child's black shoe floating in the drainage ditch in Robin Hood Hills. This discovery prompted a more focused search of the immediate area. Within hours, investigators found the bodies of all 3 boys submerged in the murky water of the drainage canal. What they found was horrifying. The 3 boys were naked. Their bodies showed signs of severe trauma. They had been hog-tied with their own shoelaces, hands bound to ankles, in a manner that suggested deliberate restraint. The bodies were submerged in approximately 2 feet of water, held down by branches and debris. The initial assessment at the scene was that the children had been beaten, possibly tortured, and killed in what appeared to be a ritualistic, or at least highly unusual manner. This initial impression would shape the entire trajectory of the investigation, and it would prove to be one of the most consequential and controversial aspects of the case. I want to pause here and discuss the crime scene itself, because understanding what investigators found and how they interpreted it is essential to understanding everything that followed. When I examine a crime scene, I look for physical evidence first. I look for blood, for fibers, for fingerprints, for anything that can be tested, measured, and analyzed. I look for patterns that tell me how events unfolded. I try to reconstruct the sequence of actions that led to what I am seeing. In the Robin Hood Hills case, the crime scene was immediately problematic. The bodies were found in water, which means any blood evidence, any trace evidence on the skin, and any DNA that might have been present was potentially compromised or washed away. The wooded area was not secured quickly enough, and multiple individuals, including law enforcement, search volunteers, and others, had trampled through the area before the bodies were discovered. Chain of custody for evidence became a concern from the very beginning. The autopsies were performed by Dr. Frank Peretti, the state medical examiner for Arkansas. His findings were crucial to the prosecution's case, but they would also become a major point of contention in the years to come. According to Dr. Peretti's autopsy reports, the cause of death for Michael Moore and Stevie Branch was listed as multiple injuries with drowning. The cause of death for Christopher Byers was listed as multiple injuries, and with the additional note that he had suffered extensive genital mutilation. Dr. Peretti concluded that the wounds on Christopher Byers were consistent with a serrated knife, and that they appeared to have been inflicted while the child was still alive. This finding was deeply significant. The prosecution would later argue that the genital mutilation was evidence of a sexually motivated crime, possibly connected to satanic or occult activity. This theory, as we will discuss, became central to the state's case against the 3 teenagers who would eventually be charged. But I need to be clear about something. Other forensic experts who later reviewed the autopsy evidence reached very different conclusions. In the years following the convictions, Multiple forensic pathologists, including Dr. Werner Spitz, one of the most respected figures in the field, examined the evidence and concluded that the injuries to Christopher Byers were not consistent with knife wounds at all. Instead, they argued that the injuries were consistent with animal predation, likely caused by snapping turtles or other wildlife in the drainage ditch. The debate over this question has never been fully resolved, but it illustrates the degree to which the initial forensic conclusions shaped the investigation in ways that may not have been warranted by the actual evidence. Within days of the discovery of the bodies, the West Memphis Police Department launched what they described as the largest investigation in the history of Crittenden County. Officers canvassed neighborhoods, conducted interviews, collected tips from the public, and attempted to establish a timeline of the boys' movements on the day they disappeared. But here is where I must be honest with you. From my perspective, reviewing the case files and the public records that have been made available over the years, the investigation was troubled from the start. There were procedural errors, missed opportunities, and what appears to be a premature fixation on a specific theory of the crime that may have led investigators away from other possibilities. One of the first names to emerge in the investigation was that of Damien Echols. Damien Echols was 17 years old in 1993. He lived in West Memphis with his family, and he had a reputation in the community. He dressed in black, he listened to heavy metal music, he expressed interest in Wicca and other alternative spiritual practices. He had a history of mental health issues and had been in and out of psychiatric facilities. In a small, conservative southern town in the early 1990s, Damien Echols stood out. Within days of the murders, police received tips naming Damien Echols as a possible suspect. These tips did not come with specific evidence connecting him to the crime. They came because of his reputation, because of his appearance, because of the fear and suspicion that his nonconformity inspired in certain members of the community. I want to be very careful here, because this is a critical point. In any investigation, tips and leads must be evaluated on their merits. The fact that someone looks different, dresses differently, or holds unconventional beliefs is not evidence of criminal behavior. But in this case, those factors appear to have carried significant weight with investigators. On June 3, 1993, less than a month after the murders, police brought in a young man named Jessie Misskelley for questioning. Jessie Misskelley was 17 years old, and he was a friend of Damien Echols. He also had a measured IQ of 72, which placed him in the borderline intellectual disability range. He had not been identified as a suspect initially, but investigators believed he might have information about Damien Echols' activities. What happened during that interrogation would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. According to police records, Jessie Misskelley was questioned for approximately 12 hours, though only about 46 minutes of the interrogation was recorded. During that interrogation, Jessie Misskelley confessed to participating in the murders, and he implicated Damien Echols and another teenager, Jason Baldwin, in the crime. The confession, on its face, appeared to be a breakthrough. Here was a participant in the crime providing details about what had occurred. But when you examine the confession closely, significant problems emerge. First, the confession was riddled with factual inaccuracies. Jessie initially stated that the crimes occurred in the morning, when the evidence clearly showed the boys disappeared in the evening. He changed details multiple times during the interrogation, often only after police provided him with correcting information. The sequence of events he described did not match the physical evidence. The descriptions of the injuries did not align with what the medical examiner had documented. Second, There was no physical evidence connecting Jessie Misskelley, Damien Echols, or Jason Baldwin to the crime scene or to the victims. No blood, no hair, no fibers, no fingerprints. In a crime as violent as this one, the absence of any physical evidence linking the suspects to the victims was deeply unusual. Third, the interrogation techniques used with Jessie Misskelley raised serious concerns. He was questioned for hours without an attorney present. He was not provided with a parent or guardian during questioning. Given his intellectual limitations, questions have been raised about whether he fully understood his rights or the implications of his statements. The phenomenon of false confessions has been well documented in the psychological literature, and individuals with intellectual disabilities are particularly vulnerable to making false statements under coercive interrogation conditions. Despite these concerns, police moved forward with arrests. On June 3, 1993, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley were taken into custody and charged with 3 counts of capital murder. The arrests sent shockwaves through West Memphis. The community, already traumatized by the murders, was now confronted with the idea that 3 local teenagers had committed this horrific crime. And the narrative that emerged from law enforcement and was amplified by media coverage centered on a concept that would define public perception of the case for years to come: Satanism. I need to address this directly, because it is essential to understanding how this case unfolded. In the early 1990s, America was in the grip of what historians and sociologists have called the Satanic Panic. Beginning in the 1980s and continuing into the early 90s, a widespread fear had taken hold that organized groups of Satanists were engaging in ritual abuse, human sacrifice, and other horrific acts, often targeting children. This fear was fueled by sensationalized media coverage, questionable expert testimony, and cultural anxiety about changing social values. Multiple cases from this era have since been thoroughly debunked. Accusations of satanic ritual abuse at daycare centers, which led to lengthy prison sentences for innocent people, have been overturned. The concept of recovered memory therapy, which produced many of these accusations, has been discredited by mainstream psychology. But in the early 90s, the fear was real and pervasive. In West Memphis, investigators and prosecutors latched onto the Satanism narrative with conviction. Damien Echols' interest in Wicca and the occult, his black clothing, his taste in music, his poetry and journal entries, all of these were presented as evidence of satanic involvement. The prosecution theory was that the 3 boys had been killed as part of a satanic ritual, and that the manner of their deaths, the binding, the alleged mutilation, the water, all pointed to occult practices. I have reviewed many cases in my career, and I have seen how theories can shape investigations. Once investigators develop a theory, they often look for evidence to confirm it rather than evidence to test it. This is called confirmation bias, and it is one of the greatest dangers in criminal investigation. In the West Memphis case, the satanic theory appears to have functioned in exactly this way. Evidence that supported the theory was emphasized. Evidence that contradicted it was minimized or ignored. The trials took place in 1994. Due to the nature of his confession, Jessie Misskelley was tried separately from Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin. His trial came first. The prosecution's case against Jessie Misskelley rested almost entirely on his confession. They acknowledged the inconsistencies, but argued that the core of the confession was reliable. They brought in witnesses who claimed to have heard Jessie talking about the murders or about his involvement in satanic activities. The defense argued that the confession was false, that Jessie had been coerced into making statements he did not understand. as in that there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. On February 4th, 1994, Jessie Misskelley was convicted of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 40 years. After his conviction, prosecutors approached Jessie with an offer. If he would testify against Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin, providing additional details about the crime, they would recommend a reduced sentence. Jessie refused. His refusal to testify against the others, even when it could have benefited him, has been cited by supporters as evidence of his innocence. If he had actually committed the crime with them, they argue, why would he not take the opportunity to reduce his own sentence by providing testimony? The trial of Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin began in March 1994, and this trial would receive far more public attention, and it would become the crucible in which the case against the West Memphis Three was forged. The prosecution's case was built on several pillars. First, they presented Jessie Misskelley's confession, not through direct testimony, since Jessie had refused to testify, but through the testimony of police officers who had been present during the interrogation. This raised hearsay concerns, but the court allowed portions of the material in. Second, they presented witnesses who claimed to have heard Damien Echols making incriminating statements. A teenage girl named Vicky Hutchison testified that she had attended a satanic gathering with Damien and Jessie and had seen them engage in occult rituals. Years later, Vicky Hutchison would recant this testimony entirely, misstating that she had fabricated the story under pressure from police. But at the time of the trial, her testimony was presented to the jury as credible evidence. Third, the prosecution introduced Damien Echols' personal writings, his journals, his interest in Wicca and the occult. They called expert witnesses on the subject of Satanism who testified that the manner of the killings was consistent with satanic ritual. One of these experts, Dale Griffiths, was later revealed to have obtained his doctorate from an unaccredited correspondence school. His credentials as an expert were questionable at best. Fourth, the prosecution presented testimony about a knife found in a lake behind Jason Baldwin's home. This knife, they argued, could have been used in the murders. However, no forensic evidence linked the knife to the victims or to the crime scene. The physical evidence in the case was thin. There was testimony about fibers found at the scene, but the connection to the defendants was tenuous at best. There were no fingerprints, no DNA matches, no blood evidence connecting Damien, Jason, or Jessie to the victims. The defense argued that the case was built on prejudice, on fear of Damien Echols' unconventional lifestyle, on a coerced confession from a mentally impaired teenager, and on junk science about Satanism. They pointed out the absence of physical evidence. They challenged the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses. But the defense was also operating with limited resources. The attorneys appointed to represent Damien and Jason were working within the constraints of the Arkansas public defender system. They had limited access to forensic experts, limited ability to conduct independent investigation, limited resources in every meaningful way. On March 18, 1994, the jury returned its verdict. Damien Echols was found guilty of 3 counts of capital murder. Jason Baldwin was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. During the penalty phase, the jury recommended that Damien Echols receive the death penalty. Jason Baldwin was sentenced to life in prison without parole. It is difficult to overstate the impact of these verdicts on the defendants, on their families, and on the community. Damien Echols, 18 years old, was sent to death row to await execution. Jason Baldwin, 16 years old at the time of his arrest, was sent to prison for the rest of his natural life. Jessie Misskelley was already serving his life sentence. 3 teenagers, still in the process of becoming adults, had been condemned for a crime that they maintained they did not commit. In the immediate aftermath of the trials, the case received little national attention. It was a local crime, a local trial, a local tragedy. The people of West Memphis believed that justice had been served. The families of the victims, while still grieving, could at least take some comfort in the belief that the killers had been caught and punished. But the case did not fade away. And what happened over the next 2 decades would transform it from a local murder case into an international cause célèbre. In 1996, a documentary film premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. The film was called Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills. It was directed by Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky, and it would change everything. The filmmakers had gained extraordinary access to the case. They had filmed portions of the investigation, the trials, and the aftermath. They had conducted interviews with the families, the defendants, the attorneys, and the community. The film presented the case in a way that raised profound questions about the convictions. Viewers across the country watched the documentary and came away with doubts. The portrayal of the investigation, the depiction of the satanic panic hysteria, the examination of Jessie Misskelley's confession, the lack of physical evidence, all of these factors combined to create a compelling argument that a terrible miscarriage of justice had occurred. The documentary sparked a grassroots movement. People who had watched the film began organizing efforts to support the West Memphis Three. Websites were created, funds were raised for legal defense. Celebrity supporters emerged. Artists, musicians, and actors began speaking out about the case. A second documentary, Paradise Lost 2: Revelations, was released in 2000. This film went further than the first, examining new evidence and new theories about who might have actually committed the murders. In particular, the film focused attention on John Mark Byers, the stepfather of victim Christopher Byers. John Mark Byers was a deeply complicated figure. He had a criminal history that included assault and drug-related offenses. He had exhibited erratic behavior before, during, and after the trials. In one particularly disturbing scene in the first documentary, he was shown holding a knife and making threatening statements. Some supporters of the West Memphis Three began to suspect that John Mark Byers might have been involved in the murders. They pointed to his violent history, his proximity to one of the victims, and his strange behavior as potential indicators of guilt. I need to be very clear about something here. Suspicion is not evidence. John Mark Byers was never charged with the murders. He was never officially named as a suspect by law enforcement. He vehemently denied any involvement in the killings. In later years, he actually became a supporter of the West Memphis Three, stating publicly that he believed they were innocent and that he had been wrong to suspect them. The theories about John Mark Byers were never substantiated, and I present them here only because they were part of the public discourse surrounding the case, not because there is credible evidence that he committed the crime. As the years passed, the legal team supporting the West Memphis Three grew more sophisticated. New attorneys, including high-profile defense lawyers, joined the effort. Forensic experts were retained to re-examine the evidence. A systematic effort was undertaken to identify errors in the original investigation and trial. One of the most significant developments came in the area of forensic science. Remember what I said earlier about the injuries to Christopher Byers, the genital wounds that the original medical examiner attributed to a knife attack. Defense experts, including Dr. Werner Spitz, concluded that these injuries were not knife wounds at all. They were consistent with animal predation, most likely snapping turtles feeding on the body while it was submerged in the drainage ditch. This finding was hugely significant because it undermined one of the central claims of the prosecution's case. The prosecution had argued that the sexual mutilation was evidence of sadistic, ritualistic behavior. If the injuries were actually caused by animals after death, then this entire theory collapsed. Additional forensic review raised questions about other aspects of the case. The binding of the victims, which had been presented as evidence of ritualistic behavior, was re-examined. Some experts suggested that the shoelace bindings could have been consistent with a more utilitarian method of control, rather than elaborate ritual. But perhaps the most significant development came in the area of DNA evidence. When the crime occurred in 1993, DNA technology was still relatively primitive. By the late 2000s, advances in forensic science allowed for the testing of genetic material that would have been undetectable years earlier. The defense team successfully petitioned for new DNA testing of evidence from the crime scene. The results were striking. No DNA matching Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, or Jessie Misskelley was found on any of the evidence tested. None. In a crime involving the violent murder of 3 children, where the perpetrators would inevitably have come into contact with the victims, but there was no genetic evidence connecting the 3 defendants to the crime. Instead, the DNA testing revealed something else. A hair found in one of the ligatures used to bind Michael Moore was tested and found to be consistent with the DNA of Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of victim Stevie Branch. Additionally, a hair found on a tree stump at the crime scene was consistent with the DNA of David Jacoby, a friend of Terry Hobbs who Hobbs had acknowledged being with on the day of the murders. I need to be extremely careful here, because this is where responsible investigation requires caution. The presence of Terry Hobbs' hair on a ligature does not prove that he committed the murder. There could be innocent explanations. Hobbs lived with Stevie Branch. Secondary transfer of hair is a documented phenomenon. A hair from a stepfather could end up on a child's belongings through normal household contact. However, the DNA findings did raise legitimate questions. Why was there no DNA from the convicted defendants found at the scene, while DNA potentially linked to a family member was present? This was a question that deserved investigation. Terry Hobbs was never charged with any crime related to the murders. He has consistently denied any involvement. He filed lawsuits against individuals and organizations that he felt had defamed him by suggesting he was responsible for the killings. Some of these lawsuits were settled, while others were dismissed. The point I want to make is that the DNA evidence introduced reasonable doubt about the convictions, even if it did not conclusively identify an alternative suspect. In our justice system, indirect convictions are supposed to be based on proof beyond a reasonable doubt. If significant evidence emerges after trial that calls the original verdict into question, the system is supposed to have mechanisms for addressing that. Throughout the 2000s, the legal team for the West Memphis Three pursued every available avenue for relief. They filed appeals, motions for new trials, and petitions for post-conviction relief. They were repeatedly denied by Arkansas courts. But the tide of public opinion continued to shift. The third documentary in the Paradise Lost series was released in 2011, coinciding with a renewed push for the defendants' release. Books were written about the case. Musicians, including Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam and members of the Dixie Chicks, publicly advocated for the West Memphis Three. A campaign featuring celebrities and legal experts kept the case in the national spotlight. In 2010, the Arkansas Supreme Court ordered a hearing on the new DNA evidence. This was a significant breakthrough. For the first time, the courts would consider the forensic developments that had emerged since the original trials. The hearing was scheduled for December 2011. But before it could take place, something unexpected happened. In August 2011, prosecutors approached the defense with a proposal. They offered what is known as an offered plea. An offered plea is a peculiar feature of the American legal system. Under an offered plea, a defendant pleads guilty while maintaining their actual innocence. The defendant acknowledges that the prosecution has enough evidence that a jury might convict, and while simultaneously asserting that they did not commit the crime. For the West Memphis Three, the offered plea offered a path to immediate freedom. They could be released from prison without having to wait for the lengthy appeals process to reach its conclusion. But there was a cost. By pleading guilty, even under the offered framework, they would have felony convictions on their records. They would be giving up their right to further legal proceedings that might conclusively establish their innocence. And perhaps most painfully, the state would not be admitting that a wrongful conviction had occurred. The decision was agonizing. Damien Echols had spent 18 years on death row. He had come close to execution multiple times. His health had deteriorated significantly during his incarceration. For him, the offered plea meant freedom, or meant survival. He accepted the deal. Jason Baldwin initially resisted. He had maintained his innocence throughout, and he was deeply reluctant to plead guilty to crimes he did not commit. But ultimately, he agreed to accept the plea. Reportedly in large part because he understood that rejecting it might result in Damien Echols remaining on death row and potentially being executed. He accepted the plea to save his friend's life. Jessie Misskelley, following the advice of his attorneys, also accepted the offered plea. On August 19, 2011, the three men appeared in court in Jonesboro, Arkansas. They entered their offered pleas, acknowledging the strength of the state's evidence while maintaining their innocence. Judge David Laser accepted the pleas and sentenced them to time served. After 18 years in prison, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley walked out of court as free men. The release of the West Memphis Three was met with celebration by their supporters and with anguish by others. The families of the victims were divided. Pam Hobbs, mother of Stevie Branch, had come to believe that the three men were innocent and supported their release. Todd and Dana Moore, parents of Michael Moore, maintained that the convictions were just and that the guilty parties were being set free. John Mark Byers, who had once been suspected by some as an alternative perpetrator, had publicly declared his belief in the innocence of the West Memphis Three and supported their release. The aftermath of the release has been complicated. Damien Echols has written extensively about his experience, on publishing memoirs and becoming an advocate for criminal justice reform. Jason Baldwin has remained more private, but has also advocated for innocence causes. Jessie Misskelley has lived a quieter life, avoiding the spotlight that has followed the others. The case officially remains unsolved. Despite the release of the West Memphis Three, the state of Arkansas has never reopened the investigation or sought alternative suspects. The offered plea, while freeing the defendants, did not exonerate them in the eyes of the law. They remain convicted felons, their records carrying the weight of 3 murder convictions. Efforts have continued to seek full exoneration. Legal advocates for the 3 men have pushed for official acknowledgement that a wrongful conviction occurred. To date, these efforts have not succeeded. The state of Arkansas has shown no willingness to revisit the case or to investigate alternative theories of the crime. I want to now step back and consider this case from the perspective of someone who has spent a career in criminal investigation. What does this case teach us? What went wrong and what might have been done differently? First, and most fundamentally, this case illustrates the danger of confirmation bias in investigation. From very early on, investigators appear to have developed a theory centered on satanic ritual and on Damien Echols as a suspect. Once that theory took hold, evidence was interpreted through that lens. Alternative explanations were not adequately explored. Leads that pointed in other directions were not pursued with the same vigor. Good investigation requires intellectual humility, and it requires the willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when that means abandoning a preferred theory. In this case, that humility appears to have been lacking. Second, this case demonstrates the profound vulnerability of intellectually disabled individuals in interrogation settings. Jessie Misskelley was questioned for 12 hours with only 46 minutes recorded. He was young, had significant cognitive limitations, and was not provided with meaningful protections. His confession, which formed the backbone of the prosecution's case, was riddled with inaccuracies and inconsistencies that should have raised immediate red flags. The phenomenon of false confession is well documented. We know that under sufficient pressure, individuals will confess to crimes they did not commit. We know that certain populations, including juveniles and individuals with intellectual disabilities, are particularly vulnerable to this phenomenon. We know that interrogation techniques designed to elicit confessions can produce false statements that sound convincing to juries. This case should have been a warning about the dangers of relying too heavily on confession evidence without corroboration. The legal system has since developed stronger protections against false confessions, but not strong enough and not consistently enough. Third, this case illustrates the devastating impact of junk science in the courtroom. The expert testimony on Satanism presented at trial had no scientific validity. The expert who testified, Dale Griffiths, was not qualified by any legitimate academic or professional standard. His testimony played on the fears and prejudices of the jury rather than providing them with reliable information. Similarly, the original forensic conclusions about the injuries to the victims have been questioned by credible experts. The autopsy findings that supported the prosecution's theory of sexual assault and mutilation may have been wrong. The later conclusion that the injuries were consistent with animal predation rather than knife wounds represents a fundamentally different understanding of what occurred. Forensic science is supposed to be objective. It is supposed to help juries understand physical evidence in an impartial way. When forensic conclusions are wrong, or when unqualified individuals present themselves as experts, the consequences can be catastrophic. Fourth, this case demonstrates the importance of DNA evidence and advanced forensic technology. The DNA testing that occurred in the 2000s produced results that fundamentally undermined the prosecution's case. The absence of DNA from the defendants at the crime scene, combined with the presence of DNA from other individuals, raised reasonable doubt about the convictions. If this technology had been available in 1993, the investigation might have taken a very different course. This is not a criticism of the investigators of that era. They did not have access to tools that did not yet exist. But it is a powerful argument for continued investment in forensic science and for the willingness to re-examine old cases in light of new capabilities. Fifth, this case raises profound questions about the adequacy of legal representation for criminal defendants. Damien Echols and Baldwin were represented by public defenders operating with limited resources. The defense did not have access to the same level of forensic expertise, investigative support, or legal manpower as the prosecution. In our system, justice is supposed to be blind to wealth and poverty. But in practice, the quality of legal representation a defendant receives is often directly related to their financial resources. The years of advocacy that eventually led to the release of the West Memphis Three were supported by significant resources, celebrity involvement, and high-profile legal talent. Most wrongfully convicted individuals do not have access to those resources. The question of how many people remain in prison, convicted of crimes they did not commit, without anyone fighting for them, is one that should trouble anyone who cares about justice. Sixth, this case illustrates the cultural power of fear and moral panic. The Satanic panic of the 1980s and early 1990s produced numerous miscarriages of justice. People were convicted of crimes that almost certainly never occurred, based on testimony that has since been thoroughly discredited. The West Memphis case occurred in this context, and the Satanic narrative that shaped the investigation and trial must be understood against that backdrop. Moral panics recur throughout history. The specific fears change, but the pattern remains consistent. A perceived threat emerges. It is amplified by media and cultural forces. Evidence is interpreted through the lens of the fear, and innocent people are caught up in the resulting persecution. It is only later, often much later, that society recognizes the injustice that occurred. Understanding this pattern is essential to preventing future moral panics from producing future miscarriages of justice. But human beings seem to have a short memory for these lessons, and new panics continue to emerge in every generation. I want to address the question that inevitably hangs over this case. If the West Memphis Three did not commit the murders, then who did? This is a question that I cannot answer with certainty. No one can. The investigation never adequately explored alternative suspects. By the time serious attention turned to other possibilities, years had passed, evidence had deteriorated, and memories had faded. Terry Hobbs has been the focus of significant suspicion, particularly after the DNA evidence emerged, linking a hair on the ligature to his genetic profile. But as I have noted, this evidence does not prove his guilt, and he has never been charged with any crime. He has denied involvement and has aggressively defended his reputation against what he characterizes as unfair accusations. Other theories have circulated over the years. Some have pointed to transient individuals who were in the area at the time. Others have suggested involvement by individuals with criminal histories who have since died. None of these theories has been substantiated. The brutal truth is that the passage of time, combined with the failure to adequately investigate alternative suspects in the immediate aftermath of the crime, may mean that the identity of the actual killer or killers will never be established with certainty. This is one of the great tragedies of wrongful conviction. When the wrong person is convicted, the real perpetrator goes free. The injustice doubles. One person is punished for a crime they did not commit, while another escapes accountability for a crime they did. Christopher Byers, Michael Moore, and Stevie Branch deserve justice. Their families deserve to know what happened to their children and who was responsible. If the West Memphis Three did not commit these murders, then that justice remains undelivered. The boys remain unavenged, and their killers remain unknown. This is not a satisfying conclusion. It is not the kind of ending that documentaries and true crime stories typically provide. But it is the truth of this case, and I believe in telling the truth even when it is uncomfortable. The case of the West Memphis Three has had lasting impacts on the American criminal justice system. It has become a reference point in discussions of wrongful conviction, prosecutorial overreach, and the failures of the legal system to protect the innocent. The documentaries made about the case, particularly the Paradise Lost trilogy, pioneered a form of advocacy journalism that has since become influential. True crime documentaries have proliferated in the years since, many of them taking on an explicitly adversarial stance toward the convictions they examine. The Making a Murderer series, the Serial podcast, and numerous other productions owe a debt to the approach developed in the West Memphis Three documentaries. Legal reforms have been implemented in various jurisdictions, though not always as a direct result of this case. Recording requirements for interrogations have become more common, making it harder for the kind of unrecorded questioning that produced Jessie Misskelley's confession to occur. DNA testing requirements have been expanded, making it easier for defendants to access forensic evidence that might exonerate them. But these reforms are inconsistent across jurisdictions, and many defendants still lack meaningful access to the resources necessary to challenge their convictions. The Innocence Project and similar organizations have continued to advocate for the wrongfully convicted. Hundreds of individuals have been exonerated through DNA evidence and other means since the West Memphis Three case began. Each exoneration represents a life destroyed by wrongful imprisonment and a system that failed in its most fundamental duty. As I conclude this examination, I want to return to where we started. 3 8-year-old boys were murdered in West Memphis, Arkansas, in May 1993. 3 teenagers were convicted of those murders and spent 18 years in prison. They were released under an Alford plea that allows them to maintain their innocence while accepting conviction. The case remains officially unsolved. What we know is this: the investigation was flawed from the beginning. The confession that formed the centerpiece of the prosecution's case was unreliable. The expert testimony on Satanism was junk science. The forensic conclusions about the nature of the victim's injuries have been challenged by credible experts. Unsolved evidence excluded the defendants and pointed to other individuals. Every pillar of the prosecution's case has crumbled under scrutiny. What remains uncertain is this: who killed Christopher Byers, Michael Moore, and Stevie Branch? What happened in Robin Hood Hills on that spring evening in 1993? Will there ever be accountability for their deaths? These questions may never be answered. The case has taken on a life of its own, becoming a symbol in debates about criminal justice that sometimes obscure the fundamental fact at its center. 3 children were murdered, and justice has never truly been served. In my career as an investigator, I have learned that certainty is rare. Cases that appear open and shut reveal complexity upon examination. Cases that seem baffling yield to patient investigation, and in some cases resist resolution entirely, their secrets preserved by time, circumstance, and human fallibility. The West Memphis Three case is one of those cases. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about our justice system, about our society, and about ourselves. It asks us whether we are willing to prioritize evidence over prejudice, careful investigation over convenient theories, and justice over closure. I do not know whether Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley killed those 3 boys. I know that the evidence used to convict them was deeply flawed. I know that they deserved a fair investigation and a fair trial, and I am not certain they received either. I know that children deserve justice, and that justice requires truth. The case of the West Memphis Three remains a wound in the American legal system. a reminder of everything that can go wrong when fear overtakes reason and prejudice substitutes for evidence. It is a case that should be studied by every law enforcement officer, every prosecutor, every defense attorney, and every citizen who cares about the integrity of our institutions. Because ultimately, the justice system is only as good as the people who operate it. It requires vigilance, humility, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. When those values fail, innocent people suffer, and guilty parties escape accountability. The West Memphis case is a testament to what happens when those values fail, and a call to do better. Christopher Byers would be 40 years old today if he had lived. Michael Moore would be 40. Stevie Branch would be 40. They never got to grow up, never got to become the people they might have been. Their lives were stolen from them in a manner so brutal that it still disturbs me to contemplate. Damien Echols spent 18 years on death row, 18 years awaiting execution for a crime he maintains he did not commit. Jason Baldwin spent 18 years in prison, his youth consumed by incarceration. Jessie Misskelley spent 18 years behind bars, his already limited capacities further constrained by the prison system. These are human beings whose lives were shaped by this tragedy. Some by violence inflicted upon them, others by the violence of wrongful imprisonment. All of them deserve to be remembered as more than characters in a true crime narrative. They are real people with real suffering, and any examination of this case must hold that truth at its center. I have spent many hours reviewing this case, reading the documents, watching the footage, considering the evidence. I have tried to approach it with the same rigor I would apply to any investigation that crossed my desk. I have tried to be fair to all parties, to acknowledge what we know and what we do not know, to avoid the temptation to reach convenient conclusions. The case of the West Memphis Three does not offer convenient conclusions. It offers hard questions, painful uncertainties, and the recognition that our pursuit of justice, however well-intentioned, can sometimes produce profound injustice. That is the lesson of this case. That is what I hope you will take away from this examination. Not certainty about what happened, but a deeper appreciation for how fragile justice can be and how important it is that we get it right. Because when we fail, when we convict the innocent or allow the guilty to escape, we betray not just the individuals directly affected, but the principles upon which our entire system rests. We betray the promise that everyone will be treated fairly, that evidence will matter more than prejudice, and that the truth will ultimately prevail. In the case of the West Memphis Three, that promise was broken. Whether it can ever be fully repaired remains to be seen, but the effort must be made. For Christopher, for Michael, for Stevie, and for every person who depends on the justice system to protect them, the effort must be made. Thank you for your attention to this difficult material. And I hope that this examination has provided you with a clearer understanding of the case, its complexities, and its implications. The search for truth never ends, and the pursuit of justice requires eternal vigilance.